Welcome back to session 51, and today we're going to make the modal a lot more fun by adding a drag gesture both horizontally and vertically, and then use rotation as well as 3D transform. So the first thing is to set a state, var viewState, to store the position of the drag, which is of type CGSize, and we're going to set it to 0. Then we're going to create the code section for the drag gesture. So var drag of type SomeGesture, curly braces, then drag gesture, parentheses, starting with unchanged, then value in, then update the view state to value.translation. Next, we'll also set the unended, so when we release, set the value in. Using with animation, let's use one of the preset, which is open card, then reset the value of the view state, so .0. With the drag gesture set up, we can go back and apply that to the modal itself. Since we want to apply to both modals, we should put this inside a group. So I'm going to move the switch and put it inside. With the group, I'm going to be able to apply the gesture using the drag that I just created. Then it's equally important to apply the offset X and Y using the view state, using width for the X value, and for the Y value, view state dot height. Let's play the preview, and here we're going to be able to drag the whole thing. And it doesn't matter if we're switching between sign up and sign in, we're going to be able to do that just fine. Now the thing is, we want to separate between the modal container from the background. So we're going to have to move some styling from those views. Let's go to sign up view and scroll down at the very end. Here we're going to find the shadow, the padding, and the background. It's important to move the shadow because we're going to be using 3D transform. As we've learned, 3D rotation effect has to be applied before the shadow. But first, let's just move these three modifiers. So I'm going to cut and paste the three modifiers right after gesture. Now you can see that the sign-in view has the extra modifiers. So we need to remove those modifiers from the sign-in view. Let's scroll down and find the shadow, padding, and background, and remove those. Head back to modal view. Now with these changes, I'm going to be able to drag just the container. I'm sure you've seen cards where when you drag left or right, it's going to rotate based on that drag. Let's add the rotation before the gesture. So rotation effect, the angle is going to be degrees. Then we're going to use the view state dot width. So this lets us move left and right. This rotation is a little bit too fast, so we're going to divide that by 40. Now we have a nice and smooth rotation as we drag horizontally. We just have an issue here, and this is an interesting problem because some of these effects, such as the shadow, is going to apply to every single element inside. And one way to avoid that is to use the corner radius because that also masks. But since we're using the background in and that is not masking, therefore the shadow is going to apply to everything and that can create conflicts. So to solve that, we can add a mask using rounded rectangle, corner radius and style 30.continuous. At the same time, it seems that the button itself is reliant on the shadow. So we're going to have to copy the shadow and go back to the sign-in view, go to the button, and apply the shadow to the button as well to create this effect. Let's do the same for the sign-up view. Then go back to modal view. Now the funny thing is, I was not planning to have this specific effect here, which is reliant on the shadow. But also I did not anticipate that the shadow would be conflicting with the gesture. At the same time, I think it's a really good lesson to have here to understand the order of the modifiers to make the difference between having a mask or a corner radius versus a background and in, and how it's going to affect using rotation or rotation 3D effect. And this is one of those things that you will master with time through experimentations. Now, the next thing we're going to do is the rotation 3D effect. So dot rotation 3D effect, axes, angle is going to be degrees, set the view state dot height, and the axes, x is going to be 1, y 0, and z 0. Now, because we're using height, we can now drag vertically, and it looks like this. It's a little bit too fast, so we're going to divide by 20, and now we have a really nice 3D effect. This is definitely optional, but you can also change the color by using hue rotation, and again using degrees, either vertically or horizontally. In this case, I'm going to use view state dot width and divided by 5. Now we have this beautiful effect. It even changes the colors of the button, and I think that's really cool. Before we finish, we should probably organize the modal views inside a folder. So let's select these 3 files, the sign up, sign in, and modal view. Right click and new group from selection. Let's name that modals. Whenever you move an active file, you might have to reopen them. This is what we have so far. I love playing with the drag. There's definitely a utility for this, especially when you drag and you dismiss a modal. That's really useful because the close button is typically too far to reach. In the next session, we're going to add some unappear animation, and also when we dismiss the modal, it's going to transition smoothly. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome back. This is session 52, and today we're going to cover the animations in the modal view. First, we'll implement the modal dismiss. So using the app storage show modal, we can go to the drag gesture, and here on ended, let's set if value.translation.height is greater than 200, then set show modal to false. Else, then it's going to reset the position, so put with animation. If you test in the preview, you can see that when I drag down after 200, it's just going to freeze. One thing you can do, instead of always running the simulator, is to go to the content view and play the preview, then pin it. So the content view is the first screen, which means that it connects every single views on top of it. So now if we go back to modal view, we still have the same content view preview. Therefore, we can navigate to the modal and we can dismiss it just like in the simulator. Now notice that we don't have a transition, so we're going to set with animation and put the state change inside. As a result, we now have the fade out transition. Let's make the modal container to drop instead. So we're going to go to the container, which is a group, and then right next to offset, let's set another offset using the Y position, then set to 100. We just need to make sure that this number here is big enough so that it appears out of the view. So 500 or 1000 to be safe. And then we're going to add a Boolean that's going to activate when we dismiss. So let's create the Boolean at state var is dismiss is equal to false. Then using that Boolean, go back to offset is dismiss question mark 1000, otherwise set it to 0 by default. Then we can go back to the drag gesture, then set next to show modal is dismiss is equal to true. Testing this, when we drag down, you can see that it drops also. But the thing is, it's barely visible and we might want to add some delay to be able to show the dismiss animation. So a solution for that is to have a separate with animation for each. First, we have the instant one that drops the modal, and then for the show modal, which hides everything, we can add a delay. So with animation dot linear dot delay to 0.3. And we can put show modal to false. Please note that we can use linear or ease in, ease out, any animation timing that you want. This mostly applies to the transition. In this case, it's a fade out. So what you'll see now is when I dismiss, it's going to drop first and then apply the fade out. To make it more clear, I can make it longer. So now it's going to wait 2 seconds before fading out everything. Let me put it back to 0.3. Next, I also want to be able to tap on the background to be able to dismiss. That's a really useful interaction for modals. The background is at the top, right next to the Z stack. Let's apply a tap gesture. So untap gesture, then replace the parentheses with curly braces. Then we'll call a function that is going to include exactly the same dismiss animation. Dismiss modal parentheses. Let's create this function. Scroll down a little bit, and the function is going to include both state changes. Let's cut this and again call that function dismiss modal parentheses. It doesn't exist yet, so we're going to create it right after drag. Func dismiss modal parentheses curly braces and paste the code. Finally, we'll be consistent and use the dismiss function also for the button. Let's replace with animation by dismiss modal. Great. Let's dismiss using the close button. It does the same animation. Dismiss using the background tab. But here we're noticing that the blob is in the way. So one thing you can do is to disable the interaction for any element. So going to the blob, we're going to use .allows hit testing to false. Once the blob is disabled, that means that whatever I click in this region is going to hit the background. So I tap here and it dismiss. And I tap here, it also dismiss. Next, let's create a sequence animation on the modal view. When it first appears, you're going to see the modal container showing first, then the title, subtitle, and the rest of the content. The blob is going to blur as well as the close button coming from the top. At this point, we don't need the pin content view anymore. We can just focus on the modal view. Let's scroll back at the very top and set the state var appear and set array false, false, false. With this, we can go to the Z stack and apply the unappear modifier. So unappear, perform, press enter. Then using the same technique with delay, we're going to apply with animation to each of the booleans. With animation, let's use ease out, curly braces. For the first one, it's not going to have any delay. So appear index 0 is equal to true. Then we can copy this and paste it twice. Change the index to 1 and 2. Then for the second one, let's add a delay of 0.1. For the third one, a delay of 0.2. Then we'll apply the sequence animation starting with the modal container. Let's scroll up a little bit right after shadow, starting with the opacity, appear, index 0, question mark, set to 1, otherwise 0. We can also add offset using the Y position, appear, index 0, question mark, 0, otherwise 200. So now it's going to move upwards. Since we're going to be using these two modifiers a lot, we can just copy them and reuse them also for the button. Right after padding, set the index to 1 this time and move from the other direction. If you want to keep testing the animation without having to stop and play, you can press space and delete. Let's finish with the blob. We're going to go to the background and apply directly to the image. Before allows hit testing, apply opacity and offset. The blob doesn't have to move too much, so we can put 10. Then we'll add a blur as well to appear, set it to 2, question mark 0, otherwise 40. We also need to update the appear index for offset and opacity. So testing this, it looks pretty good. We can go to the animation timing and also add a duration for the third for the blob. So parentheses after ease out and set it to 1 second. Now it's going to have a slow blur animation for the blob. Now for the inner elements, we're going to go to the sign-in view and repeat the same steps. So state var appear is equal to false, false, false. Then we'll start with the title using the same modifiers and index 0, but it's not going to move as much. So let's set offset to 20. I'm going to use 20 moving forward, so I can copy this and apply that to the subtitle, changing the index to 1 for the subtitle. And finally, I'm going to apply it to the group, changing the index to 2. For this third Boolean, I want it to apply to the fields, the button, and the text. So I'm going to move the group to be before the text field. Then we need to set the indentation for those elements. So Control I. We also need to move the font styles to apply to the H tag. Otherwise, it's going to apply to the button and the fields as well. And finally, we're going to apply the same unappear modifier. We can just copy from the modal view, going back to sign-in view, apply that after unchanged. So this looks pretty good. We can definitely remove the duration, and to play a little bit, we can change from ease out to spring. The same for the other two. And also we can add some additional delay for the inner elements versus the modal view. So 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3. Now we can test from the sign-in view. Then we can also test from the modal view, as well as from the simulator or the content view. I definitely recommend that you play with the number of elements in your animations, as well as the animation timing. As homework, you should try to apply a similar animation for the sign-up view and have fun with it. In the next session, we're going to learn how to load images from a URL asynchronously by using a sync image. I'll see you in the next session. Hi, welcome back to session 53, where we're going to learn about a sync image. So far, we've been using images from the assets catalog. This is instant, but at the same time, it does take space in your app's download. Now, normally when you have an app that has a lot of images, you want to make that on demand and retrieve them from a database somewhere using an API call. So typically, the images that you're going to store in the assets catalog are the icons, the logo, the default avatar as some examples. For the rest, you want to load them asynchronously using the new async image in iOS 15. First, let's create a new view in a components folder. So new file, we're going to name this one avatar view. Then we're going to replace the text by async image, parentheses. It's going to require a URL. So we're going to use lorem pixum because it has a very short URL. And using this right here, it's going to randomize images. So URL, parentheses, string, quotes, then paste that URL. One thing to note about async image, while loading from the internet, it's not going to freeze the app versus the image will, but since it's from the assets catalog, unless it's really, really big, then you're not going to notice a difference. So it's important to load images asynchronously, especially when you have a lot of them, so that you can do other things at the same time, such as scrolling or navigating the menu or closing a view. Now back to the async image, we're going to customize the frame to set a width of 200 and a height of 200. You should also play the preview in order to see that image. Let's add some corner radius using corner radius set to 20. Now, if your frame was smaller or bigger than the original size, you might want to use resizable. In order to do that, you need to set curly braces, image in, then image.resizable. But when you use image in, you also need to set a placeholder in which you can show a progress view while it's loading the image. The progress view is the loading indicator in the middle. Let me fix the indentation here. Now, if your frame was 300 by 300 and we don't have resizable, it's going to stay 200 by 200. That's why resizable makes it more adaptive. Now, as soon as you make API calls, it definitely comes with complexity. For example, what happens if there's no internet connection? What happens if there's an error? If it's successful, if it's empty, all of those cases are what makes API calls complex. So async image supports that. Now, instead of using image in with placeholder, we're going to use phase in, and we don't need a placeholder. Then using the phase, we can set if statement and then take care of each phase. But since we have many cases, we're going to use a switch phase curly braces. Now we can start with the obvious case, which is when it's successful. So case dot success, and it's going to return to us the image. We can set let image colon and use that image and make it resizable. When we're not dealing with all the possible cases, often it's going to suggest the right missing cases. So we can use those suggestions. Empty is like the placeholder, so we can use progress view, parentheses. Failure, use a color that is gray. An unknown default, then we can use an empty view, parentheses. So as you can see, it works almost exactly the same way, except that now we can deal with the empty case as well as the default case. What about animations? You might have seen that when we go to a website or to an app, it starts loading, and once the loading is finished, it starts transitioning using scale or using a fade in. We can do that using async image. We're going to go to image and apply dot transition. Let's start with the scale animation. Use the option scale with anchor, setting to 0.5 and the anchor to center. Right now you don't see any animation, and that's because we need to set something similar to with animation. But for the async image, we're going to set that right after URL, comma, transaction, then press enter. We're going to use transaction initialize with animation, and you might guess it can be ease out or ease in or spring. Please keep in mind that in my version of Xcode, the preview won't show the transition, so I'm going to have to test it in the simulator. Since this is the avatar view, we'll apply that to the navigation bar. And the avatar is in the top right. Let's scroll down a little bit to find the avatar. We're going to copy exactly the same styles for the image, so cut that and replace the image by avatar view, parentheses. Then go back to avatar view and paste the style to replace the frame and corner radius. Now we just need to remove resizable. Awesome. So now we can test it in the simulator. As you can see, the transition is working properly. So that's how you use the new async image. Before iOS 15, we had to rely on a third-party library to make the code simpler. Otherwise, we had to create our custom solution, which is very complex. With this new API, it's really useful and friendly. In the next session, we're going to create the sign-in and sign-out experience by using app storage. So I'll see you then. Hello and welcome to session 54. Today we're going to cover the sign-in and sign-out experience. Right now, by default, is showing the avatar and it shows the sign-in modal. What we want to do is to be able to click on sign-in and then dismiss the modal, shows the avatar. From there, open the account view, add a sign-out button, and show the default avatar when you're not logged. Now, I'm not going to cover the data aspect because I want to focus as much as possible on iOS 15. But if you want to learn more about data and Firebase and API calls, I definitely suggest taking the advanced development in swiftUI as well as swiftUI Combine and Data. Let's head to the navigation bar and create an app storage for the login state. App storage, parentheses, is logged. It's going to be a boolean, so var is logged is equal to false by default. Next, we're going to go to the button. Let's scroll and find the button right here. Previously, we disable show account and we're showing the modal. But now it's going to be dependent on the boolean state. So right before show account, let's set if is logged, curly braces, then uncomment and move show account inside the curly braces. Else, curly braces, then move with animation inside that. With this, when we tap on the avatar, it's going to open the correct view depending on the state is logged. But we haven't configured the other actions such as the sign in button and also showing the correct avatar. So we're going to do that next by heading to the avatar view. Here, using the app storage again. So app storage, parentheses, is logged, var is logged, is equal to true by default. Then before setting the if condition, we need a parent container. And also that parent container will let us reuse the same styles, whether it's the default avatar or the async image. So we're going to use a group for that. Embed the async image inside a group, move the modifiers to the group instead, and set the if statement before async image. If is logged, then show async image. Else, then we can use the default avatar. So just drag and drop from here or write it from scratch. And we also need the resizable. Let's fix the indentation. Awesome. Now we can test this by setting is logged to false. Then it will show the default avatar. Otherwise, we can set it to true. And that will show the async image. The next step is to go to the modal sign-in view and set the user to logged when we tap on the sign-in button. Now, instead of retyping the app storage, I'm just going to copy it from the navigation bar and go back to sign-in view, paste that right after environment object, then scroll down a little bit to find the button, and where there's an empty action, let's set is logged to true. Now, the only missing part is the account view. Remember that once we're logged and we tap on the avatar, it's going to show this view. And we just need a way to sign out. Typically is a button at the very bottom. So right after environment, let's put app storage. Then after the links, we're going to create a button. Button, curly braces, empty action, label, set a text, sign out. This sign out, we're going to make it red using a tint that is .red. For the action itself, let's change is logged to false. Now there's just one final thing. When we tap on the sign out, we also want to dismiss the account view. Otherwise, it's going to be stuck there. It might change the state, but the view itself stays here. A normal behavior is to dismiss the view, just the same way as clicking on done, except that we're also changing the log state. Now there's a new technique in iOS 15 to dismiss a modal. Normally you use environment presentation mode, but there's a simpler way, which is dismiss. Then use a variable dismiss. Notice that before iOS 15 we had to use presentation mode wrap value. Now we can just delete that and stick to just dismiss parentheses. The dismiss is only for the done button. We also need to apply that for the sign out button. So dismiss parentheses. Let's do the same for the sign-in view. But this is a little bit different because this is a custom modal. So we have a function in modal view to dismiss that. It's at the very bottom. So the logic is that when we tap on the button from the sign-in view, it changes the state is logged. So we can listen to that change and then call the dismiss function. Let's go to modal view, and right after on appear, set on change of is logged, but we haven't set is logged yet. Let's do that. Scroll up a little bit and set app storage parentheses is logged, var is logged is equal to false by default. Let's go back. Then on change of is logged, perform, press enter. Since this is a Boolean, we can just set if new value. So if this is true, then call the dismiss modal function. Now with this, when we're logged, it's going to show the account view. We can sign out. It's going to dismiss. Otherwise, it shows the default avatar. We tap on it. It goes to the sign in. Then tap on sign in. It's going to change the state. And by listening to that state change, we run the dismiss function. Then voila, we have a nice sign in and sign out experience. That works with the animations and the custom modal. In the next session, we're going to cover async await. And just like async image, it's going to let us run asynchronous functions without freezing the app. And this is perfect for API calls. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, this is session 55, and today we're going to cover async await. This time, we're going to make an API call and get JSON data. So when I open this view, it's going to get a random location, and also I can use the new refresh button in ios15 to refresh that data. Now the API that we're going to use is the random data API. It's really easy to get started, and you have a bunch of different data that you can use. Today we're going to focus on the address. So here, this is the JSON data, and we get a random city, street name, and other data if you want to use them. Now, async await is part of the new swiftUI concurrency, and if you want to dive deeper into the topic, we have a full course around that. To get started, let's go to account view, and we're going to create a new function. So func fetch address parentheses. Because it's a function that's asynchronous, we have to set it to async curly braces. When a function is async, it means that we can run that function without having to freeze the app while waiting for the response. First, we'll declare a URL, and this is the API is equal to URL parentheses string, and then we'll get the URL from the API, which is in the address bar. So let's paste that. Using that URL, we can use URL session, which is going to make the API call. It has to be async, so .shared data, and we're going to use from, which is asynchronous, and it also throws a response. So let's select that, set URL. We don't need the delegate. Now the URL itself cannot be optional, so we can put an exclamation point after. So URL session is supposed to give us a response. We're gonna declare that using let parentheses because we have multiple values. The first is data, and the second one we don't need, and set the equal sign. The other thing is, because this is asynchronous, we're gonna set a wait so that we wait for the response before going to the next line. And also, we need to set it to try because we need to catch errors. So when you use URL session, you need to wrap everything inside do curly braces and then put that inside. Then we're going to catch the error, then put the error inside the catch statement. To reiterate, async means that you can run the function while doing other things at the same time. And await means that we're going to wait for the response of URL session before running the next line of code. Then try, do, and catch means that we may get an error from the URL session, and therefore we should show the error if necessary. So now that we have the async function set up, we can use the new task, which is a new modifier that will let us run an asynchronous function. Let's type fetch address, and because this is async, we're going to set await before. For the time being, we're not going to use the data yet, and we're going to print that to the console log. So print data that we're going to receive from the API call. This data is in a specific format. First of all, we're going to set it as a string, parentheses, decoding, colon, data. Then close the parentheses, comma, as colon, and now we're going to set to the format of utf8.self. To show the console logs, we're going to have to run this in the simulator. Then let's go to the account view, and this should print the data. So you can see the same JSON data that we got from the website. Let's close this, and we can start decoding the data and match that to a data model so that we can use it for the UI. Let's create a new data model. Right-click, new file. Let's name this address. Remove the layout code. Struct address of type identifiable, comma, decodable, because it's a JSON format, curly braces, var ID of type integer. So basically we're trying to match the same data structure from the website. And we're limiting to the data model here, which means that we're only going to get the country and the ID. The country is going to be a string. Now using the data model, we're going to go back to account view, scroll back to the top, then we're going to set the state. State var address of type address, which is a data model. And we can also set a default address. So address initialize using ID and country. Let's set it to 1, and the country, for me, it's Canada. And then using this state, we can put that in the UI. Let's go to the profile, and here where it says Canada, I'm just going to put address.country. Awesome. So far, we're only getting the default value. This is not from the API call yet. So let's scroll back to the top. And instead of printing, we're actually going to use the data. Now, the same way that we've been decoding the data so that we can print, we're going to decode the data so that we can update the state. So address is equal to try JSON decoder, parentheses, dot decode, then the data type, and from the data. The data type is the data model that we just set, dot self, from the data that we're getting from the API call. So essentially we're matching the data to the data model. And as a result, we can use that to update the state. Notice that as soon as we have that, the country has updated. And we can press space here. It's going to keep updating the data. Now for the error, what we can do is either print something, or we can also show it in the UI. So we can update the state and set it to the data model using ID, and the country we can set a text that displays an error. So I'm going to put error fetching. Now one really cool feature that is new is the modifier called refreshable. This is a one-line pull to refresh feature. So dot refreshable. And when it refresh, we're going to run await fetch address. Thanks to refreshable, I can now pull the refresh just like this, and it's going to refresh my data. Let's do it again, and voila. So this is really cool and effortless. So that's how you set up a simple single data API call. But in the next session, we're going to get a list so that we can have multiple items and loop through it, and also use observable object to manage it. So I'll see you in the next session. We are at session 56, and we're going to cover async await, but specifically using an API call that is going to give us a list of items. As an example, here we have the coins. And again, this is using random data API, and you can practice using other kinds of data. The one that we're going to use is called crypto coin. Now for this data, I can also get multiple items by doing question mark size is equal to 10 results. So now it's going to give me a list of 10 items. We can copy this URL and use it later on. Back to Xcode. We'll start by creating the data model. Let's right click on the model folder, new file, and we'll call this coin. Remove the layout code, struct coin of type identifiable, comma, decodable, curly braces, and now we set the data that we want to use, starting with ID of type integer, var coin underscore name of type string, var acronym of type string. And by the way, I'm essentially using exactly the same names. So you can see coin name, acronym, and finally, we're also going to use the logo, which is going to take an image. So var logo of type string. Next, we're going to set the observable object in the same file. So class coin model of type observable object, curly braces, at published var coins of type an array of coin, which is the data model that we just created, is equal to empty array. For this class, the same way that we set the function to make the API call, instead we're going to do it here, which is more manageable. Typically, you want to keep the layout code inside the views, but the functions and the data should be part of the data model files. So func fetch coins, parentheses, this is async, curly braces. Then we're going to start with a do because we're going to use URL session as well as a catch to deal with the error. Then let URL is equal to URL string, and then we're going to paste the URL from our API. Remember that we added the size is equal to 10. Let's add an exclamation point because this is not optional. Then we're going to declare the data that we get from the API call, data underscore, and the second value, we don't need it, is equal to try await URL session dot shared dot data. This is going to be from and the URL. For the delegate, we don't need it. Finally, using the data that we get, we're going to store that to published. So coins is equal to try JSON decoder parentheses dot decode a value type from data. The value type is an array of coin. Let's not forget self because it's at the root and from the data that we get from the API call. Now that we have set the data model as well as the observable object, we can use it anywhere in the app. It's important to point out that if you run it like this in the simulator, it's going to give you an error that says you have to run this in the main thread. So to do that, we can add at main actor right before the function. Then also for the catch error, we can set print error. So we're going to go back to account view. Then we're going to set at observed object var coin model is equal to coin model parentheses. So this is the observable object, and this is what we're declaring so that we can use it. Now let's scroll to the body, and right after links, we're going to add the coins. This is a new code section that we need to create. So let's go to the links, and right after that, we're going to create var coins of type SumView curly braces. Now we're going to create a new section. So section, and this is going to have a header, which is going to have a text that says coins, curly braces, and we're going to set for each using the coin model dot coins, which is the array. Then curly braces, and we receive coin in for each item. Then we can print text coin dot coin name, which is from the data model. So let's resume this. And right now it's not going to show anything, and that's because we're not running the function yet. Let's scroll back to the top to find the task and refreshable. We can essentially use the same events, and this time we're going to do await coin model dot fetch coins. So when we do that and when we play, it's going to give us the list of coins from the API, which is really cool. And likewise, we can do that for refreshable, await coin model dot fetch coins. When we do pull to refresh, it's going to refresh the data as well. Everything's working nicely. We just need to deal with the rest of the data. Let's go back to the coins. And here for the text, we're going to embed in the VStack. Then we'll set a second text, this time using coin acronym. And we'll set a font dot caption. We can also change the color to foreground color dot secondary. We should definitely align the text to the left. So alignment dot leading, and add a little bit of spacing of 4. Finally, we're going to add an image to the left. So embed in HTAG, and here we're going to load an image from a URL. So we're going to be using a sync image. Parentheses, URL, then URL parentheses, the string is going to get from the data, so coin.logo. Then curly braces at the end, receiving the image in. Using that image, we'll set image.resizable parentheses. We're also going to set the aspect ratio. We don't need the first value, we just need the content mode, and we're going to set it to fit. Now, because we're using image in, we also need to set the placeholder, then type progress view to set the loading indicator. Now you can see that the images are way too big, so we're going to set the frame to width 32 and height 32. Awesome. With this, we managed to create a super simple API call using observable object, and it's going to get a list of items that is going to load, and we can also use pull to refresh. Now in the next session, I want to talk a little bit about performance, and we're going to create an option to turn on and off light mode so that you can increase performance. So I'll see you in the next session. Welcome back to session 57 of my swiftUI course. Today we're going to talk about performance, how to optimize things, and what are some of the culprits that will affect the performance of your app. Now, if you've done web development and iOS development, as you make your design stand out more, you're definitely going to use a lot of techniques, and sometimes it's easy to go overboard, especially the number of drop shadows, the number of material blur. And sometimes you can make mistakes where Applying a drop shadow will also apply to inner elements. So performance is definitely affected by these expensive effects. Even though iOS development is considered very performant compared to other platforms like web or non-native platforms like React Native, it doesn't mean that you can just put drop shadows everywhere and blur everywhere. When it comes to animation, you need to make sure that it's not running at the same time as other expensive animations. So using delay and moderation is definitely recommended. For example, if you're going to move a lot of pixels, make sure that you're not moving dozens of them at the same time. Most importantly, I'm going to show you how to test the performance. Now, this is not to say that you shouldn't use drop shadows and blur and these amazing effects. In fact, if you use it with moderation, your app will not be affected almost at all. So you just need to make sure that you're in control. Let's go to Xcode. From the home view, let's go to the featured item. In this case, we're using a background blur for the whole card. And that's fine by itself. Apple does that a lot, especially for the control center and the modals. But when you combine that with a lot of drop shadows, and let's say you have to scroll, then you have inner elements like this one, and you might have hundreds of cards as you scroll, then it may affect the performance. Now, in this example, the question that we should ask ourselves is this material blur here necessary for this card? Oftentimes, it's a component and that's fine, but other times it's not a component, and so we can customize this specific image. So if you notice a drop in performance of your app, an alternative to this that will not take away the visual, so instead of using a material, we can change that to a color that is going to adapt. Parentheses, UI color dot system background. And then we can apply an opacity of 0.1. Now going back to the home view, you'll see that it's not very different both in light and dark mode. Now let's talk about the drop shadows because they are everywhere. Most designers use them, Apple use them, and especially in modern design, the drop shadows have become much larger than before. So the larger the drop shadow, the more it's going to affect performance. Because drop shadow, if you think about it, it's essentially an element that is blurred. And blur is one of the biggest culprit of performance. Now what we're going to do is to scroll to featured. And if you notice a performance drop, reduce the blur size. So instead of radius 10, I'm going to set it to 5 with a Y of 3. Now I agree, it looks better with a larger drop shadow. It feels more natural and modern. So what you can do is to create a light mode version. I'm going to go back to the top, set app storage. It's going to be a boolean is light mode, var is light mode, is equal to true by default. Now, it would be amazing in the future if we're able to detect the newest iPhone versus the older iPhone, because that's the main problem, right? It's because a lot of people are still using old devices. Personally, I haven't found a solution to detect the capability of the phone. So for now, we're just going to set it to true by default. So going back to featured, what we can do is to set the opacity to 0 if it's in light mode, or you can also set the radius to smaller in light mode. In this case, I'm going to set the opacity. So is light mode, question mark, set it to 0, otherwise 0.3. Again, it bears repeating that you should test your app on an older device to see if that improves the performance. But typically, there might be other issues. But here we're focusing on the visual performance. With the boolean here, we just need a way to turn it on and off. We're going to do that in the account view. Let's set the app storage. App storage is light mode. Var is light mode is equal to true. Using this, we're going to scroll down a little bit. Right after menu, we're going to add a section. Then I'm going to use the toggle control. Here, we'll use is on with label. The binding is $is light mode. And the label, just press enter. Then we can put a label so that we can use an icon as well. It's going to have a text light mode. Then add a system name. By default, we use the tortoise. So it looks like this. And we're going to set a condition. So is light mode, question mark. Then show the tortoise, otherwise show the hair. Then we'll apply the accent color using primary. So now we're going to test the app using Command R. Now you can see that we have the drop shadow, and if we go to the account view, the light mode is off, showing the hair. Then if we turn it on, it's going to show the tortoise, and we go back, the drop shadows disappear. Going back to Xcode, when you run the app, you're going to see the console logs, of course, but also you can go to the debug navigator. And here you're going to find the CPU performance against usage. So as you scroll and as you navigate to different screens, you're going to see the CPU usage fluctuate over time. Likewise with memory, and this is specifically with how many things are running at the same time. And the disk is typically when you're doing a network call and you're downloading images, it adds to the space that it uses. As for the network, this is the bandwidth, so the speed of the download and upload. Now, if you want to learn more about performance, I can suggest the swiftUI Combine and Data, where we talk more about performance. And also in the course UI Kit for iOS 15, we have a part about performance and how to use instruments. So to summarize, it's important to test your app in the simulator as well as on the device, especially if you have an older computer. You're going to see a much greater lag than me. Secondly, in terms of visual, the main three culprits are drop shadows, blur, and animation. So the question that you should ask yourself is this necessary? Can I achieve a similar effect without using those three things? And finally, this is not to discourage you to use them. In fact, I want you to experiment and use them more with the knowledge that you have now. Part of the challenges of the developer and designer is how to push the boundaries, because it's going to happen no matter what. And learning about these things is what will make your skills so valuable in the market. So I hope you found this useful. I'll see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome back to session 58. And today we're going to customize the progress view and also create a custom progress view. Then we'll update the course view as well as create the section view. Let's start by creating a new component, new file. We're going to call this one circular view. Replace the text by circle. What we're doing here is to create the Apple Watch ring progress. So we can start by using trim from 0 to 0.2. This is going to draw the circle based on the number. So 3 is going to go bigger, and 4, and so on. Now we just want to have the border, so we're going to use stroke, then set the style. Now here we have something called a stroke style, but the thing is, and this will happen when you work with names, is that it's going to conflict with the native framework. So I'm going to go to style, the styles file, and here I can see that I have a name that says stroke style. So there's a neat feature in Xcode that allows you to refactor effortlessly. So right click on that, click on refactor, rename. It's going to show all instances of that name across all the files. Let's replace that with stroke modifier. Press enter. Now if you go back to circular view and you do Command B, which is to build, the error will change a little bit. So now we can double click on stroke style. Instead of green, it's now purple. Parentheses, and we have these options. Start by line width set to 4, line cap set to round. For the other values, we don't need them at this point. Next, we're going to customize the color by using a gradient. So fill dot angular gradient. I'm going to use the colors option, which is an array of colors. Let's do purple, then pink, then going back to purple. The center is going to be center. Start angle, I'm going to use degrees, 0, and end angle, degrees 360. Awesome. Now, just like the Apple Watch ring, it's going to start from the top. And I'm going to use rotate for that. So, rotation effect, degrees 270. Great. So this view, I'm going to make it customizable, and it's going to take the maximum space so that I can customize from where I reference it. But for the progress value, I will set the value. Var value of type CGFloat is equal to 0.2 by default. Then replace the hard-coded value by value. Another thing we can do is to set the appear animation so that it starts with here and it's going to transition to the progress value. Let's set a state. Var appear is equal to false. Then on the circle itself, dot on appear, perform, press enter. With animation, using spring, and perhaps adding a little bit of delay of 0.5 curly braces, and change appear to true. Also, when it disappears, because it's a component, I can set undisappear, perform, press enter, and appear is equal to false. This does not need animation. Then we can set the condition appear question mark, go to the value, otherwise start with 0. Now if you play this, you'll see an animation. Next, we're going to build this section right here. For that, I'm going to need the data model. So let's create that, new file. I'm going to call it course section, enter. This is essentially the same steps as the course data model. So I'm just going to copy and paste, and you can get this code from the text content. Now we have ID, which is auto-generated, title, subtitle, text, image, background, logo, and progress. The progress is going to be passed to the circular view, and it's going to animate. Next, let's create each row in that list as a component. Right-click, new file. I will call it section row. Let's start with the data. Var section of type course section, which is the data model, is equal to course sections, which is the data sample, and I'm going to use the first item in the array. Create a title, so section.title. I'm going to make this font weight semi-bold, and I'm going to add more text by using a VStack. It's a text before, so text section.subtitle. For this, I'm going to use a caption, and dot weight is medium. Set the foreground style to secondary. If you remember, the foreground style works better when it has a material blur in the background, and the foreground color is more general. Let's set the text after. Section.text, font caption as well, weight medium, foreground style secondary. And finally, we can use the progress view like this. Now, if you remember, by default, the progress view shows the loading indicator. But if you customize the value, it's going to look like a progress. So value using section.progress. And now it looks like this, using the accent color, which is pretty cool. You can customize the accent color. So accent color, I'm going to set it to white. Also, I'm going to set a max width. Frame max width of 132. Great, let's set the alignment. So alignment to leading, and I'm going to set a spacing of 8. I'm also going to add an image to the left by using an H stack. So right before the V stack, image, parentheses, section.logo. I'm going to make this resizable, then set the frame to width 36, height 36. Let's mask it using a circle. If you look at the design, we have a double circle and the circular view. So padding 12, then set a background color. I'm going to use an adaptive color, UI color dot system background. This is going to be black in dark mode and white in light mode. Set the opacity to 0.3. Then again, use mask with a circle. Finally, we can add the circular view by using an overlay, circular view, parentheses, and I can just set the value to section.progress. This is awesome because it's a custom progress that I just created. Now, before we finish, we're gonna set the alignment for the H stack, alignment to top, and the spacing to 16. Also, I want to make my tappable zone to have some padding. So for the H stack, let me add a padding of 20. Now I'm going to head to the course view. For the content of the course view, this is supposed to be for the section view. And the section view has a similar structure to the course view, except that it has the text content instead of the list. So we're going to create the section view as well. Let me right click on course view, new file, section view. Now I'm going to go to the course view and copy everything inside the course view struct. So this is going to be pretty long until it's draggable. Copy and put that inside the section view. So we're going to change a lot of things. If you want to skip this part and it's confusing, feel free to use the code provided. A lot of these values are for the match geometry effect. So we're just going to keep two things, which is the data and the environment object. Let me remove everything else, the binding, the namespace. So if you do Command B, it's going to give you a lot of errors, and you can go on them one by one. So I'm going to keep things simple. Let's start with the match geometry. Let me remove all of them. One trick is to use Command F, match geo, and here you can find using Command G all instances of it. Then we don't need the appear anymore. So I'm going to search all of them. So we don't need the function for the animation and anything with appear. For appear, you can delete the first part and the last is the default value. Next, we don't need the show part. Let's search for it. I can remove the function for close, show toggle, and that's it. Then the view state, which is for dragging. Now I can remove the entire drag gesture, as well as everything for the gesture, including the backgrounds and the scale effects. So I'm just going to keep background and ignore save area. I know this is confusing, but it's a very good exercise to know where your code is, what to remove, and how it's going to affect your data, your UI, etc. Next, to simplify things, we can also remove the scroll parallax. So remove the coordinate space and the geometry reader as well. When you remove the beginning, you have to remove the end. Then anything related to scroll Y. Let's start from the top. Delete only the first part. If it's 0, then it's useless. Likewise for the background image, the mask, and the overlay content. Now the frame here, because it was applied to the geometry reader, I'm going to move that to the V stack. Then we can fix the indentation using Control I. Awesome. Now we can see that we have a lot less code and we can go back to course view. So the goal here is to replace the text content and create a list instead. Let me go to the content, and here I'm going to delete pretty much everything inside the VStack. Then I will reset the alignment and spacing of the VStack. And now we can create a loop using for each, parentheses, using course sections, and then curly braces section in, then use the section row that we created. Now we're going to pass the section data. Next, we can create a container for the VStack. I'm going to use a background dot ultra thin material in rounded rectangle, corner radius 30, style continuous. Then I'll use the stroke style using a corner radius of 30. Now for the alignment of the content, I can use alignment to leading. Now I can also add a divider. So divider before the section row. And if I want to hide the first one, I'm going to need to know the index. If you remember, we need to put courses inside an array, and the courses section is going to be dot enumerated. Then at the end, I'm going to set ID / offset. For the data that we receive, we're going to start with the index, then section. Thanks to the index value, I can set if index is not equal to 0, then you can show the divider. Now having the index value is also useful so that I can tab and go to the section view. For that to happen, I need two new states. The first is to set a state var show section is equal to false by default. And then the second is to set the selected index is equal to 0 by default. Then going back to the content, I'm going to set untabbed gesture. And here we can update the selected index using the index that we receive and show the section to true. Finally, on the VStack itself, we're going to add the sheet presentation with is presented, set the binding to show section, dismiss we can remove, and the content is going to be referencing section view parentheses. And here we can pass the data, but we forgot to change the data. So let's head back to section view. And this is not the data course, but the section instead, of type course section, and the data course sections. Now it's going to complain about course not being found, so we can just go to each of them and replace with section, which has similar data. And then the last one, which is section.title, section.subtitle, and section.text. Resuming this, you should see pretty much the same data structure, even though the data is different. Now let's go back to course view, and now we're going to pass the section data using the array course sections with the index value to selected index. Awesome. Now I can select the section data. It's going to open the modal presentation, but the close button is not going to work because it's using something custom. Let's head back to section view, and we're going to use the environment variable, which is dismiss, so that we can dismiss the modal presentation, var dismiss. Now I'm going to jump to the button, and here instead of using the environment object for show detail, I'm going to replace the whole thing, including with animation, to dismiss parentheses. Another thing I can do, since I'm using a modal view, I can remove the rounded corners. So let's jump to the cover and set the corner radius to 0. Great. Now if you run this, we're going to be able to go to the course view and then to the section view. Then dismiss it and go back to home. The same with match geometry, using exactly the same views, it works seamlessly. If you've never done refactoring or duplicating views, this part might be challenging, and I think it's good that you can practice it and go through the process that I went through. In fact, a lot of these parts were repeats of previous sections, so my suggestion is to try to do it on your own as much as you can. And by doing that, you're going to improve your development skills in the long run. In the next session, we're going to create a giant play button here, and also we're going to create the explore view. So I'll see you in the next session. Welcome back to session 59. Today we're going to create this play button right here, first using an SF symbol, and then we're going to use the Swift code from an SVG. First, let's create a new component, new file. We're going to name this one play view. Let's start with the SF symbol. Image, system name, play.fill. It looks a little bit like this, and it's very small. What you can do is to set the font.system using the size. I'm going to make it 60. Also, I'm going to change the frame size to width 120 and height 120. With this, I can set a background color, and it's going to use ultra thin material, then in rounded rectangle, parentheses, corner radius and style, 46 dot continuous. Because I'm using the rounded rectangle, I can also use my stroke style instead of a circle. So stroke style, corner radius, 46. Let's add a shadow. So dot shadow, color is going to use my preset color, shadow, setting opacity 0.2, radius 30, Y 30. Then I'm going to add the timestamp on top by using overlay. This is going to be a text that says 12:08. Then I'm going to set the indentation. I'm going to use font footnote dot weight dot semi-bold. Let me move it a little bit by using offset Y44. I'm also going to add a little container. So padding vertical is going to be 2, and padding horizontal is going to be 4. Then set the background using a color that is adaptive, UI color dot system background with opacity 0.3. Then I can also set a corner radius of 4. Now, if you want to use a custom shape like this one, command click on it, right click, then copy as SVG. Now we're going to go to this website where we're going to turn the SVG code into Swift code. So paste that code, convert, and select all of this and copy. Going back to play view, I'm going to pass all of that code at the very bottom. Then change from my custom shape to play shape. Finally, I'm going to replace the image to play shape, parentheses. Now the font is not going to work for the sizing, so I'm going to replace it with a frame of width 52 and height 52. Then I'm going to change the color before the frame using fill, and the color is going to be the shadow using an opacity of 0.8. Now, if you work with the play button inside a circle or around the corners like this, sometimes you have to visually move it so that it looks in the center rather than technically centered. So what I'm going to do is to add an offset using X position of 2. Depending if you're using a circle or rounded corners, this number may change. And unfortunately, you have to do it by what feels right. Then if I want to add a border, I'm going to use overlay. Then the same shape, parentheses, use the stroke modifier to dot white. Just make sure to add the overlay before the offset, like this. Then we can also add a gradient blur by using background, again, play shape, parentheses, set the indentation, then set a fill with dot angular gradient using colors. I'm going to use dot blue, dot red, then dot blue. Center to center. Start angle to degrees 0, then degrees 360. Great. Now I can add a little blur. So blur with a radius of 12. Now I have this beautiful effect. Now let's add this play button to the section view. So on top of the cover, I'm going to add overlay, play view, parentheses. Then using the size of the play view, I can use overlay again. And this time, let's use circular view. Now, if you're using the rounded corners, it's not going to work perfectly with the circle. So you can add a little bit of padding to fix that. And we're going to pass the value to circular view using section.progress. Let's reduce the padding a little bit to 24 so that it doesn't overlap with the timestamp. If you want to customize the line width of the circle, we can go back to circular view and set var line width of type double is equal to 4 by default. Then replace 4 by line width. Going back to section view, I'm going to pass the line width to the circular view. So line width, let's say 5. Great, now it's time to create the explore view, and I'm going to challenge you to try to do it by yourself as much as you can. So here we're using the navigation view, of course the tab view. Then we have these cards that can scroll horizontally. Now right next to home view, I'm going to create a new file, explore view. So because we have a custom background, I like to start with a Z stack. Then let's set the color, parentheses, background, and I'm going to ignore save area. So this is a custom color. By the way, if you don't want to go through this, feel free to copy and paste the code from the text content. Next, I'm going to set the content inside a scroll view, so embed scroll view. Then I'm going to use my custom navigation bar by using overlay navigation bar. Here it has the title, which is recent. Now, because it needs to detect the scroll position, I have to pass has scroll, and it's a binding, but I can make it constant to either true or false. Let me just make sure that the content is taking enough space by using frame max width to infinity. Then I'm going to add a background using the image blob 1. And I'm going to move that a little bit using offset x minus 100, y minus 400. Now we're going to create these small course items. So it's a component, right click, new file. I'm going to call that small course item. Let me start with the data. Var course of type course is equal to courses index 0 by default. Using this, I can start with the course.title. Then I'm going to make it to font weight dot semi-bold. Let me put this into a VStack. Put a subtitle first, course.subtitle. I'm going to set this one to caption, foreground color, secondary, then line limit to 1. Now I'm going to start with the rectangle first and put the image on top. So rounded rectangle, corner radius and style 20, continuous. Set the fill to black with opacity of 0.1. Then I'm going to put an overlay with the image course.image. Let me set the indentation, make it resizable, set the aspect ratio, only the content mode to fit. Then set the frame to width 150, height 105. Now the container, I'm going to limit the size First, starting with the padding and then a frame of width 160 with a height of 200. The background is going to use ultra thin material in rounded rectangle. Corner radius and style is going to be 30, continuous. Finally, using the stroke style, corner radius 30 as well. And that's basically it. We can now use that in the Explore view. So here, instead of the text, I'll put small course item parentheses. Then command click on it, make it repeat. I'm going to use courses with course in, then pass course to the small course item. Then put the for each inside h-stack. Let me set the spacing to 16. And now for the horizontal scroll, I just need to set the option .horizontal. So if I play this, I'm going to be able to scroll like this. For now, since I don't have bottom content, I can put some spacer. If I don't want to have the scroll indicator, I can remove it by setting shows indicator to false. Now the scroll bar doesn't have any space. We need to set some offset from the navigation bar. So we're going to use .save area inset, edge to top. Content, I can just use curly braces for that. Then I'm going to use color.clear.frame, set a height to 70. For the scrollable content, I can add a little padding to the h-stack. So padding only horizontal to 20. That looks pretty good. I might want to set the text here to align to the left. So let's go back to small course item. Set frame max width .infinity, alignment to leading. Also for the v-stack, set alignment to leading. And a little bit of spacing to 2. Great. Before we finish, hopefully you have exactly the same as me or very similar. We should create a code section for the horizontal scroll. So including the scroll view itself, it's going to be called courses section, and then right after body, var courses section of type sum view, then paste the scroll view. Now we can connect this to the tab bar by going to content view. And here, instead of referencing the account view, I'm going to change to explore view. Let's run this. Now we can navigate to the explore view, and there we go. This is the view that we just created. Hopefully you managed to do a lot on your own and you had a lot of fun implementing it. In the next session, I'm going to cover about dynamic type sizes, and then we can continue creating the handbook cards as well as the list rows. So I'll see you in the next session. Hello and welcome back to session 60 of the course. Today we're going to cover accessibility, specifically with dynamic type sizes, so that we can set a range of font sizes and make sure it's not going to break our UI when the text is set to really, really big. Another thing that we're going to do is to continue the explore view. Now, when you build your app on the simulator, you have the option to go to the environment overrides. And here you can change between light mode and dark mode. And also you can see how it's going to look like with different dynamic type option. As you can see, when it gets really, really big, it actually breaks the layout. So we're going to cover this, but it's interesting to note that you also have other options, such as increased contrast, which seems to affect the blending mode as well as the material, reduced transparency, bold text, reduced motion for animations, on-off label, button shapes, grayscale, smart invert, and differentiate without color. Now, by putting back to the normal size, we can see that some of these options can be broken. While I'm not going to cover all of these options, I think it's good to keep them in mind in the future as you build your skills in iOS development. So turning them off, we can just go back to the way it was. Now let's go to the content view. Now remember that you can also test the options for accessibility from the preview. So for example, I can set to extra large and then fix from here. Let's try a little bit bigger to make it break the layout. This is what we're trying to fix, and normally you want to avoid ellipses, elements overlapping, but elements like these are considered fine. And looking at the layout here, we have some overlap. But what is great about dynamic type is really that the font size adjusts to the accessibility settings. And especially when you're building something custom, you have to pay attention to how it's going to look. A few things that I want to note is that titles are typically fine because they're big anyways. The main point of big font sizes is for people to easily read any text. And a lot of apps tend to have really, really small text for the body text and for the captions and subtitles. And I want to point out that it's okay to make mistakes. Even Apple, in some of their native apps, there are accessibility problems at really, really big font sizes. But that doesn't mean that accessibility is not important. It's the opposite. We need to think about these things before design, during design, and after design. And we need to keep testing as we create new screens and components. Now, the first option that is new in iOS 15 that is really useful, especially if you want to start simple before diving really deep into the topic, is to use a modifier called dynamic type sizes. And we're going to use the range. So we're going to set to .large and then triple dot to extra large. So what this does is that it's going to set the minimum possible dynamic type size to the maximum possible dynamic type size. As a result, even if users choose really, really big size, it's not going to go any bigger than what you have set here. And since we're applying it to the content view, it's going to apply to every single components and views inside the app. This is obviously a quick fix, and there are many cases in which you should go case by case. For example, the featured item here, we should be able to detect if the accessibility option is bigger than a certain font size, then we can apply 1 line or 2 lines of text. So I'm going to go to the components featured item. Now there's an environment variable that is going to let us detect the accessibility size. It's at environment, parentheses, / size category, var size category. Now using this, we can go to the course text, and here for the line limit, we can set size category. If it's bigger than .large, then question mark, set it to 1, otherwise set it to 2. We can give it a test by changing the dynamic type size to bigger than large. In that scenario, you can see that it's switching to 1 line. Another thing that we can do, which is really useful for titles, is to make sure that it's always at that dynamic type size. So we're going to use, again, dynamic type size, but instead of using a range, we're going to set it to .large all the time. So there you go. These are some of the basic techniques in dynamic type sizes. As you can see now, my layout is pretty much fixed when I try to go to a much bigger accessibility size. Of course, I can make a lot more effort and go case by case. And I think at this point, I want to challenge you. I'm going to leave some of these problems so that you can practice those techniques yourself. Next, we're going to create the handbook card. So again, try to do this yourself before following me, and then we can compare the results. First, we're going to create a new file in the model folder. We're going to name this one handbook. Then, since this is quite repetitive, I'm just going to copy and paste the data from the text content. Next, we're going to create a component for the handbook item. Handbook item, resume the preview. I'm going to start with the data. So var handbook of type handbook is equal to handbooks 0. Let me start with the title, handbook.title. It's going to use a font weight semi-bold. Then I'm going to create a VStack and set the subtitle, handbook.subtitle. This is going to be font caption using a weight medium. Let's set the foreground style to secondary. Then add the text, so handbook.text, font caption again. Likewise, I'll set the foreground style to secondary and the line limit to 3. You might have noticed this is very similar to the small course item. So we'll create a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 20, set fill to dot black using opacity 0.2. I'm going to limit the height by using frame height of 90. Then I'm going to add an overlay for the image, handbook.image. Let's set the indentation, make it resizable, set the aspect ratio to fit. Then set the frame to width 150 and height 100. This makes the image go bigger than the frame. Now we're going to take care of the container. So on the VStack itself, I'm going to start with a padding, which by default is 16. Then I'll set a frame to have a max width of 200. Since I can't mix max width and height, I'm going to create another frame with a height of 260. The max width makes it so that it can resize to smaller, but the height itself is just a fixed number. Next, we'll set the background to ultra thin material using in rounded rectangle, corner radius of 30 and style continuous. Then set my custom stroke style using a corner radius of 30. Now this is where we're going to set a second layer and use 3D transform. So it's going to be a background. The background is going to be a rounded rectangle with corner radius and style 30 continuous. Then I'm going to color it using fill. It's going to be linear gradient using colors. The array starting with red and then blue, starting from the top leading to bottom trailing. Now with this shape, I'm going to use rotation 3D effect. Let's set the degrees to 10. The axes x0, y1, and z0. Now another thing we can do with rotation 3D effect is to add the anchor, and I can set it to bottom trailing. Now you can see it's starting to get pretty interesting. Now I can use rotation effect using a degree of 180. Then set a padding trailing, which is from the right, to 40. So now it creates the effect that I want, and it's starting to look pretty cool. There are definitely multiple ways to achieve the same result, and this is one of them. Finally, I'm going to align the text in the VStack. Alignment to leading, and I'm going to add some spacing of 8. I'm also going to push the content to the top, so I'm going to add a spacer at the bottom. That's now pretty accurate to what we have in the design. Now we can make the gradient customizable. So if you look at the handbook data, we have the color 1 and color 2 that we can use for the gradient. Let's scroll down a little bit to find the linear gradient, and instead of hard coding it, we can use handbook.color1, then handbook.color2, color 2. If we want to test the different items in the array, we can set handbook to handbooks. I can set it to 1 or 0. Let me put it back to 1. And here we have a title that has equal priorities against the other text, but we want to have a bigger priority. So a good trick to deal with this is to go to the element that you want to have priority and set layout priority to 1, because the other ones will have 0. Now you can see that it falls back to a smaller line limit, and that's exactly what we want. All right, let's use the handbook item to the Explore view. So for the content here, I'm going to put it inside a scroll view. Scroll view, and I'm going to put the course section here. This is going to allow me to scroll vertically as I have more content, and horizontally just for this section. Now we'll add another section, handbooks section, and right after courses section, let's create that var handbook section of type SumView. Then we'll reference the handbook item, parentheses. Let's make this repeat and use handbooks from the data, handbook in. Then I'm going to pass handbook using the handbook data. So this is what I have so far. I'm going to use an H tag, embed in H tag, then set alignment to top and a spacing to 16. Also, I'm going to add a padding horizontal to 20. Next, I'm going to add a title. So for the handbook section, let's put a text popular, set the text to uppercase, and I'm going to set the font to footnote and the weight to semi-bold. The foreground color is going to be secondary. Then I'm going to set the frame to align that to the left by using max width, infinity, alignment to leading. Also, I'm going to have a padding to 20. Because we're going to use this title in multiple places, I'm going to create a title modifier. So let me cut these 4 modifiers and go to the styles file. Then before the stroke modifier, let's set struct title modifier of type view modifier, curly braces. Then set the body, and using the content, I'm going to paste those modifiers. Then we can set the extension. So extension view of curly braces, func title style, parentheses, return SumView, curly braces. Then using the modifier, parentheses, title modifier, parentheses. Let's go back to Explore view and put dot title style. Next, let's do the topics in between these two sections. First, we'll create the data model, topic, remove the layout code, and paste the data model. Again, you can use this from the text content. Next, we'll create list row. Then we'll set the data. So var topic of type topic is equal to topics index 0. Starting with the title again, topic.title, set the font weight to semi-bold. Let's embed this inside an H tag and use an image system name topic.icon. Now we'll set a frame of width of 36 and height of 36. Then we'll use a background ultra thin material and mask it using a circle. Let's push everything to the left using a spacer and set a spacing of 16. Great. Let's use the list row and create the list inside the Explore view. Before the text, I'm going to put another text this time with topics to uppercase, and I'm going to use the same title style. Then we'll create a new topics section and create that at the very bottom. So var topics section of type SumView, then we'll call the list row parentheses. Now we're going to repeat this again using topics, topic in. Let's pass the data topic to topic. Next, we're going to put this inside a VStack, then set the padding to 20, the background to ultra thin, in rounded rectangle, curly braces, corner radius and style 30 continuous, with a stroke style of a corner radius of 30. And finally, we're going to add a padding that is horizontal to 20. So that's basically it for the layout. Now we're starting to have a lot of views. And when you start having more than 3 or 4 views of the same type, it's a good idea to put them inside a folder to keep things organized. So we have the views for the modal, and then we have the main views, so the home and the explore view. I'm going to put that new group from selection to main. The match view, we can delete it because we don't need it anymore. Then we have the sheet views, so account and search. I'm going to put it inside sheets. And finally, we have the detail views. Put that inside detail. Let me put detail next to main, sheets, and then modals. I like to keep things closely related together and in a specific order. So for example, the most important first. For the components, I'm going to put the items together by using command. I can select multiple. Also for the rows, put this inside items. Then I'll put the buttons together. So avatar view and play view, new group from selection, buttons. Finally, we can put these other 3s that are more graphics related. I'm going to put it inside graphics. Again, in order of most used to least used, I'm going to put the graphics at the bottom. I'm going to skip organizing the model folder and the styles folder for now, but feel free to do that as well. So that's what we have so far for the Explore view. On top of learning about dynamic type sizes and some of the tricks to get you started to make the easiest fixes to the more specific fixes, I hope you challenge yourself to try to create the topics layout as well as the handbook layout by yourself. And if you did, you should definitely pat yourself on the back. I hope you're learning and you're having fun. And I'll see you in the next section where we're going to cover voiceover and the rest of the layouts. So I'll see you in the next session. Welcome back to session 61. And this is the final one of my swiftUI for iOS 15 course. Today we're going to cover voiceover, and I think it's a very important topic that is not being covered enough. Now, if you've never played with voiceover, you should build your app for the simulator first, and then you're going to go to Xcode, open Developer Tool, and Accessibility Inspector. So let's focus here. It's important to go to the top menu and select the simulator. From here, you're going to be able to click on the Inspect tool and then hover any part of your UI. When you work with VoiceOver, you want to make sure that anything that you select is relevant. So for example, maybe we don't want to include the wave in the background, and you want to combine these elements to be part of the card. Also, some elements are not even inspectable, and that's not as intended. So you can press on Escape to reset, and I'm going to navigate to the home screen and try again. So here you can see that this blob here is in the way. I want to be able to combine all of these elements for the card itself, and you can turn on the speech to be able to hear what each of these elements are supposed to say using voiceover. At the same time, you get a lot of these accessibility traits that can help you determine if it's correct or not. Let's go back to Xcode and go to the home view. Then we're going to select, let's say, the scroll view. Now in Xcode 13, you also have the accessibility inspector, which is right next to the attribute inspector. If you select an element like the text, it's going to give you the information about that element. So this is useful to determine if an element is considered a button or a text, and also the content of the label itself, because that's going to be read in VoiceOver. Let's start with the blob because that is in the way. So one thing we can do is to make some elements hidden from VoiceOver. I'm going to go to featured and then find the blob. So if I want to make an element hidden, I can set .accessibility and there's an option for hidden. I'm going to set that to true. Likewise, there's a blob in the modal view. So I'm going to go to the modal view and find the blob, set accessibility to hidden to true. Now I'm going to head to the navigation bar. If you remember, I was not able to select the account button. So let me scroll down a little bit to find the account button. And here you can see that there's no label. So what I can do, I can force an element to be an accessibility element. As a result, this will be selectable for VoiceOver. But the thing is, it still doesn't have a label. So I'm going to set accessibility label. I'm going to set it to account. Now with this, it doesn't seem to think that it's a button. So another option is to add accessibility traits to is button. As a result, now it has the correct label as well as the trait as a button. So far, we've managed to fix the blob, so it's no longer in the way. And also we managed to make this avatar view selectable, and it's considered a button, so we added a trait as well as a label. Next, I'm going to show you how to combine elements together, because all of this card is selectable, but I don't want each of these elements to be individually inspectable by VoiceOver. So we're going to combine. Let's go back to Xcode in home view. Then we're going to find the featured. Now for the featured item, I'm going to use the modifier accessibility element, but I'm going to set children to .combine. I can also copy this and do the same for course item by going to cards. Here, I'm going to find the course item and put the accessibility element right on the course item like this. As a good practice, whenever something is tappable, you should wrap that inside a button. But in this case, we're using untap gesture. And if you do that, it is important to set the accessibility trait to is button. So when you do that, you can quickly inspect, and especially now you can see that we have multiple ones. And now the label reads this way with all the content combined. If I didn't have this and I try to inspect, you can see that it's completely different. So that's what combine does. Let's not forget to add the trait as well for the featured item. Another good trait to have is header, and that is for these titles right here. We actually have one in Explorer as well. So we can actually go to the modifier and set that to every single title style. So accessibility trait set is header. Now going back to Explore view, if you resume and you inspect each of these titles, you're going to see that we have the header trait. Then we also have the modal trait. So we're going to go to the content view, and to the modal view here, we can set accessibility traits is modal. So these are some of the traits that you can apply to make it more clear for voiceover. Some of the best practices, as I mentioned before, is to make sure that your buttons have the trait button or are wrapped inside a button element. As for the images, if we go to the course view and go to the course.image, now if we inspect this, you can see that sometimes these labels are simply the name of the image. So for those cases, you can definitely set accessibility label and make it more clear what this image is about. So for example, cover image with a description. But this should definitely be more dynamic and should be taken from the data itself. You can set the title, the description, but it has to be describing the image itself rather than something unrelated. If we build and we test the app again, you can see that we have fixed most of the problems. This is not perfect by any means, but hopefully it showed you some of the basic techniques for supporting voiceover, especially for a custom layout. If you want to learn more about accessibility, there are many videos in the developer app at the WWDC where you can learn so much more about accessibility. So I'm going to link that in the description. Before we end this course, let's create the two remaining views, including the notifications as well as the library. For the notifications, going to the course view, the layout is pretty similar to the content section. So I'm just going to copy the code from that. Let's go to content. And here I'm going to copy everything, including the VStack, to the padding. I don't need the sheet for now. Then I'm going to create a new file after explore, notifications view. Let's set up the content first. Since this is the section row, I'm going to call it sections section. Set it to var sections section of type sum view, curly braces, and paste the content. I'm not going to deal with the tab gesture, so I can just remove this, but for the rest, it should work correctly. Then I'm going to embed this inside a ZStack, put the background, which is color, background, set ignore, save area. Let's make the content scrollable. So embed, scroll view, then set the background blob. So image, blob 1, set the offset to x minus 180, y 300. Before the background, I'm going to set the overlay for the navigation bar, setting the title to notifications, and has scroll, it's going to be a constant to true. Because we're using that navigation bar, we're going to set this save area inset to top, and the content is a color.clear, then the frame with a height of 70. And that's basically it for the notifications view. For the library view, it's almost the same as the explore view, except that we have these cards here. Let's create a new file, then name that library view. Now, we can essentially reuse the same code as the explore view and pick and choose what we want to use. So I'm just going to copy everything and remove what I don't need. So everything inside the struct, I'm going to move that to library view. Now the only difference is the handbook section is not needed, and this is called certificates. So let me go ahead and delete the handbook section. Then scroll back to the top. And here we're going to create the certificate section. But first, I want to create each certificate. Let's go to components item, new file. I'm going to name this certificate view. Now I'm going to start with the title. It's going to be swiftUI for iOS 15. Set the font to title 3, then the weight to semi-bold. I'm going to put this inside a VStack and create another text, certificate. Then I'm going to make it into font, dot subheadline, the weight to dot medium. Then I'm going to set the foreground style to secondary. For the VStack, I'm going to set the alignment to leading and the spacing to 8. Then I'll embed to another VStack because I'm going to push one at the top and one at the bottom. Let's start with the text, Feb 25, 2022. Set it to uppercase. Set the font to footnote, weight semi-bold. Then embed this inside a VStack and put another text, design code, instructor, mang toe. Then set the font again to footnote, weight dot medium. For both texts, I'm going to set the foreground style to secondary. And also, I'm going to align using the VStack to leading and spacing of 8. Now I'm going to add a spacer in between so I can push the content. I want to make sure that the alignment for both are to leading as well. Now for the whole container, I'm going to set a frame to max width dot infinity, alignment to leading. The logo is similar to the featured item, so I'm just going to copy this whole code here using the image and put it inside certificate view using overlay, then paste in between. Now for the image itself, I can just use one from the library and it's called logo 2. Let me just move this image to the far top right. So I'm going to use frame, max width, infinity, max height, infinity, and alignment to top trailing. Then after overlay, I'm going to add a padding of 20 and a background using ultra thin material in rounded rectangle, corner radius and style, set it to 30, continuous. Likewise, we're going to set the stroke style corner radius to 30. Now we're going to go back to library view, and after certificate, we can set certificate view parentheses. Then we can set a frame with a height of 220. Now where it gets interesting is when we start adding a background. The background is going to use a rounded rectangle, corner radius and style of 30, dot continuous, scroll down a little bit, then set a fill using linear gradient with colors, and I'm gonna set this one to dot purple, then blue. Start point top leading, then bottom trailing. Let me add some padding of 20, and I'm gonna move it using offset Y to -20. So I can essentially copy and paste the same background modifier to add a second card. Now for this one, I'm going to set to teal and blue. The padding is 40 and offset -40. You can't really see it, so perhaps we can put the certificate view before the course section. Then if we do that, we should add a padding of 20. Now, depending on the position of your cards, you might want to set the offset to -30 and -60. So now we have this beautiful effect using the cards. We just need to change a few things, such as the title here. So this is library. And these cards, I'm going to move the title before the courses section and change this to history. Now, if we play this, we're able to scroll and it works nicely. At this point, what is left is to update the content view, specifically the views for the tab bar. So the third one is notifications view, and the fourth is library view. Lastly, you might have noticed that when we scroll down for some of these views, it doesn't offer enough space for the bottom. So you might want to update the save area inset to 88 instead, And if you do that, then you need to go to the tab bar as well and update the condition for 88. So this is the final result of the app. We also created the Explore screen, the notification screens, and the library. Everything is functional. Of course, it's not perfect, but that's entirely up to you to improve and customize and make it your own. If you give it a try and step outside of your comfort zone, you're going to be able to adapt the tab bar, these cards, the backgrounds, the logo, the images, the icons, to create an app that you feel that is yours. And of course, improve accessibility, make it adapt for light mode and dark mode, apply the scroll detection for the navigation bar for these other screens, improve a sync image using caching, working with real data and a real login system using a database. So those are some of the challenges that are ahead for you. As I mentioned before, there are many courses that I suggest to take after this one, including Build Quick Apps with swiftUI. Then we have many new designs that you can implement yourself as a practice from our courses. You should also take the advanced courses for swiftUI, such as Advanced Development, swiftUI Combine, and Concurrency, as well as swiftUI for iOS 14 and swiftUI for iOS 13. They have different designs and different techniques, so it's highly recommended to take them on top of this course. I hope you enjoyed learning swiftUI with me, and I'll see you in the next course.